Welcome to the Big Game Hunting Podcast, where we help hunters like you prepare for the big game hunting adventures you've always dreamed of. Now, here's your host, John McAdams.
Hello, John McAdams here, and you are listening to episode 333 of the Big Game Hunting Podcast. There's a saying I really like that goes, "It ain't what you don't know that gets you into trouble. It's what you know for sure that just ain't so." That quote is often attributed to Mark Twain, but fittingly, considering the content of that quote, I don't think Mark Twain actually said it. But that quote is very appropriate for the content of today's podcast. As promised, we're going to talk about the alleged incident where Roy Weatherby supposedly killed a Cape buffalo with the .257 Weatherby Magnum today. Not only is this a pretty wild story, because after all, a .257 Weatherby is a much smaller cartridge than what people normally use to hunt Cape buffalo, but this is also a subject where there are very few facts about the actual incident in circulation. I attempted to dig into this subject a little bit more for my recent .25 caliber episode, and I was approaching this subject from the point of view of someone that had heard that Roy Weatherby killed the Cape buffalo with the .257 Weatherby. I assumed it was true. I wanted more information about that incident in order to share it with my audience as part of that episode. Digging up details about this incident proved to be much more difficult than I anticipated, and you'll find out why here later in this episode. But suffice to say, I turned up so much information and the process was so long and drawn out that instead of this being a simple thing I would talk about for 1 or 2 minutes as part of the .25 caliber episode, this actually turned into its own episode. So that's what we're going to talk about here today. Now, if you haven't already done so, make sure you listen to episode 328 where I talk about all of the various .25 caliber cartridges in detail. And I talk about the characteristics and history, best recommended uses, all those sort of things for the .257 Weatherby, along with all the other .25 caliber cartridges in that episode. But today, we're going to focus completely on the .257 Weatherby and this incident where Roy Weatherby supposedly killed a Cape buffalo with it in Africa many years ago. Buckle up, folks, because this is going to be a good one. Before we get started, make sure you are on my email list. If you like the podcast, you will love those emails. To join my list, click the link in the show notes or go to huntingguns101.com. Sign up there. You'll get my free ebook on the best hunting calibers, and you'll also start to receive the emails I send out every weekday about hunting, shooting, ballistics, those sort of things. I hear from people all the time telling me how much they enjoy receiving those emails, so make sure you are getting them too by going to huntingguns101.com and signing up. Now let's get started talking about Cape buffalo hunting with the .257 Weatherby. Like I mentioned in episode 328, it is almost impossible to discuss the .257 Weatherby Magnum without someone bringing up the often repeated story that Roy Weatherby killed a Cape buffalo with his .257 Weatherby Magnum. This is a subject where you'll find a lot of assumptions and opinions on whether or not doing so was a good idea, but very few facts about this incident. What year did it happen? Where was he hunting? Where did he shoot the buffalo? What rifle was he using? What bullet was he using? How far did the buffalo run afterwards? I was having a very difficult time digging up the answers to those questions. And this is not limited to just blowhards on social media or online forums either. In fact, Terry Wieland talks about this in the .257 Weatherby section, which he authored in Art Alphin's book, Any Shot You Want. And his description of the incident is pretty darn typical of the information you are easily able to find about this incident. I'll quote from page 338 of Any Shot You Want. Will Roy Weatherby once killed a Cape buffalo with one in an attempt to prove his hydrostatic shock theory. I wouldn't try it, and no one I know, including the people at Weatherby, would recommend it. End of quote. While I do not disagree with Terry's thoughts on this subject, even a person like Terry, who is very knowledgeable about this sort of thing, still doesn't talk about this incident in detail. And like I said, that's pretty typical of the information you'll find at first glance about this when you try to dig into it a little bit. If you're going to research anything Weatherby, the book Weatherby, the Man, the Gun, the Legend by Gritz Gresham and Tom Gresham is a good place to start, just for Weatherby history in general. So I bought a copy of that book and I read it. It's very interesting and entertaining, especially if you're a gun nerd like me who likes to learn about this stuff. The authors talk about all sorts of things relating to Weatherby in this book, but the thing most pertinent to this discussion is the transcription of Roy Weatherby's diary entries from his 1948 safari in British East Africa. This hunt took place in modern-day Kenya and began on June 7th and ended on July 15th, 1948. So this was an almost 6-week-long safari, and Roy went on that hunt with several other American hunters. They went over there not just for adventure, though there would be plenty of adventure on this hunt. For one thing, Roy wanted publicity, and he also wanted to test out his cartridges and rifles on a broad spectrum of game. Africa is a great place to get all of those things, right? Adventure, get to test out that stuff on a bunch of different species of game, and then use the results of that hunt to generate some publicity for his brand and for his company. Because remember, this was 1948. Going to Africa was still a very, very exotic destination. Getting there was a giant pain in the rear. International air travel was still in its infancy at the time, and very few Americans had the opportunity to hunt in Africa. So Roy and these guys that went over there with him had a very unique experience where they could go over, do this hunt, test out these Weatherby cartridges, and then Roy could write about his experiences in different hunting and shooting magazines and go on TV and talk about it, do all these things that he ended up doing and get a lot of publicity. And this is, of course, just in addition to having a good time and gathering real-world data about how the different Weatherby Magnum cartridges perform on different species of game with a couple of different types of bullets, different shot distances, different shot placement on these animals. And really, even to this day, Africa remains a very unique place specifically to do that, where you can get a lot of experience hunting a wide swath of game in a pretty short amount of time. Now, Roy himself brought rifles chambered in .257 Weatherby, .270 Weatherby, .300 Weatherby, and .375 Weatherby Magnum on that hunt. He kept a detailed diary of the events of this trip, and there is a section of the book, Weatherby, the Man, the Gun, the Legend, dedicated to those diary entries. Now, Roy's diary is a primary source. I learned all the way back in grade school, those are the best sources to use for research. Now, primary sources are not perfect, and just because it is a primary source does not mean that everything contained in it is true. People lie. They misremember. Sometimes they misinterpret things. Even so, you should assign the highest credibility to a primary source like this because it was written by someone who was there and who say they witnessed what happened. Really, I can't think of a more reliable source for what Roy Weatherby did or did not do than his own diary entries. Now, in my initial research for this subject, I heard some people even talking about the fact that Roy Weatherby killed an elephant with the .257 Weatherbys, right? So not only did he kill a Cape buffalo with it, but he killed an elephant with that round as well. I don't think that is true, but Roy does say in his diary he killed an elephant with the .300 Weatherby on this hunt. I'll read to you from pages 175 and 176 of the book. I have the .300 Magnum specifically loaded with 220 grain full patch bullets, 2 of them, one in the chamber, one in the magazine, followed by 2 more silver tip 220 grain. However, the first shot must do it, for if it doesn't, one never knows what might happen. If the elephant screams, all hell will break loose. The elephant may charge us. Also, the one shot, if not wounded badly enough, he may charge. Thoughts run through my mind rapidly. Should I not have my .375 Magnum? Should I use Brown's .470? No, we killed one fellow with a .375 Magnum, and Porter's kill was with the .300. I am sold on velocity. I must shoot him in the brain. Once you look at the size of one of these animals, you realize that without question, there is no bullet fired from any shoulder rifle, whether it be my 300 or the great 600 double barrel, that will kill an elephant unless hit in a very vital spot. There is just too much animal there. Even a heart shot will not stop him. He will keep on going, sometimes for miles. Soon the old boy turns sideways. Up with my rifle, and I aim where his brain should be. And remember, there is a lot of bone and meat that a bullet must penetrate before it reaches that fatal spot. 1.5 foot of it. I squeeze the trigger, and the animal falls. Never a sound. End of quote. That might seem like a wild thing to do, and it is to a certain degree, but the 300 Weatherby is considerably more powerful than the 7x57 and similar cartridges Karamojo Bell used to kill all those hundreds of elephants back in the early 1900s. In fact, a 220 grain 30 caliber bullet has a sectional density of .331, and a 175 grain 7mm bullet has a sectional density of .31. So that shot from the 300 Weatherby probably penetrated even better than Bell's 7mm, which was really good in that regard itself. Put it in the right spot, the bullet will reach the brain and turn the lights out on that elephant. I would not recommend trying to do so yourself, but this is not a hard story for me to believe at all. Roy also talks about shooting multiple buffalo with the 375 Weatherby on this hunt, and he went on and on singing the praises of this cartridge and the fact that cartridges that size don't usually work that well on buffalo. And remember, he's speaking from the perspective of a guy in the 1940s using a 375. The perception of that cartridge is different now. But that different perception of the cartridge is undoubtedly due to the fact that we have better bullets now than was the case back then. In any case, he kills an elephant with the 300 Weatherby. He shoots a couple of buffalo with a 375 Weatherby. That's all pretty easy for me to believe. Let's move on and get back to the 257 Weatherby and the buffalo. Over the course of that safari, Roy uses the 257 Weatherby on game like topi, Grant's gazelle, Thompson's gazelle, warthog, and zebra, among other animals. All of those creatures are right there in the spectrum of what most people, myself included, consider quote-unquote reasonable to hunt with that cartridge. And it seems like he had pretty good results using a couple of different bullet types on those creatures with the 257 as well. Now, Roy specifically mentions on page 146 that he wants to try the 87 grain 25 caliber bullet on a buffalo. So that was definitely on his mind on this hunt as well. Here is the quote. Back to the question of lightweight, high-velocity bullets, which is the whole reason of this expedition. Not enough knowledge has been gained as of yet to give a report. I have used all of my rifles now, and so have the other men, but not under identical conditions for comparison. One thing is sure, and that is, the bullet must be traveling at a certain velocity when it hits the animal in order to kill by shock, no matter where it hits. I must find out at what distance or the velocity the bullet must hit the animal so the shock kills instantly. The 270 Magnum with a 150 grain core lock is not it. At least it has not proven to be so far. I am convinced at this point that the 130 grain 270 bullet is superior at almost any point. The 87 grain bullet in the mag seems to have more killing power at 100 yards than does the 100 grain bullet. You remember the buffalo that carried away one of my 375 Magnum 300 grain silver tips, two of my 220 grain silver tips from my 300 Magnum, and one shot from the 470 double? You must hit them right unless the bullet has sufficient velocity to disintegrate. Now, I am going to try the 87 grain 25 caliber on them. This may have the shock we are after. If this is true, it will revolutionize firearms in the future. End of quote. I did not know Roy Weatherby personally, but that sounds exactly like something he would be interested in trying. Now, it's worth saying that I don't know exactly what he was thinking when he wrote that. It's possible that he was looking to shoot the buffalo with the 257 Weatherby as sort of a proof test to say, hey, look, it did so well when I shot the Cape buffalo with this 257 Weatherby. I'm not necessarily recommending it to go Cape buffalo hunting, but man, it did so well on this Cape buffalo that you should have no concerns at all about using this cartridge on a deer, an antelope, or an elk, or similar sized game. But then again, in that passage, he also talks about his desire to learn more about his quote-unquote shock theory and finding the right bullet and the right velocity that if you shoot an animal with it, no matter where in the body you hit it, it will kill that animal. So it's possible that he was also just trying to see if the 257 Weatherby was a reasonable choice, something that could cleanly kill a Cape buffalo, and provide more evidence in support of his theory. Now, he does shoot a buffalo with the 257 Weatherby a couple of pages later, but it did not occur under the circumstances most people allege. I will read the passage of note from page 150, and then I'll talk about it. Now, the passage I just described about him wanting to shoot a buffalo with the 257 Weatherby was from June 21st. The passage I'm about to read is from June 23rd of this hunt, and I quote, "We're on our way again after a good long night's sleep. The moon is as beautiful as ever. It's about 7 a.m., and we're on our way back to see the buffalo kill. The lion should be there. Not 15 minutes from camp, I see 11 large buffalo walking off across the plain. As we come closer to about 300 yards or so, we stopped, jumped out of the truck, ran for a distance, and started shooting. 3 shots from my .375 Magnum, and one bull hit in the leg and crippled. He started falling out of line and headed for the bush. We went to the bush, and there he was in the middle. I let him have another shot from my .375. The animal was through. This one had a 42-inch spread. That's a large buffalo. I'm happy now. This animal went down with the 3rd shot from my .375 Magnum using solid or full patch bullets. These buffaloes sometimes carry off 12 to 15 shots from large, heavy rifles. I'm convinced now my .375 Magnum is large enough for any animal in Africa, or at least as good or better than any of the doubles. We skin him out. The skin is more than a half-inch thick. We investigate to see where the bullets went and what they did, and they did plenty. 1 in the foot, 2 in the body. However, I shot him once after he was dead with the 87-grain bullet from my .257 Magnum at 3,950 muzzle velocity. Then we cut into him to see what had happened. Some say the bullet will not go through the thick hide without blowing up. This has long been a controversy with the hunters. Let me tell you what it will do. It not only penetrated the hide, but it made a very nasty hole in the meat of the ham and clear on through the bone, shattering the hip bone into many pieces and right on through to the innards. Now that's it. That's firsthand. I am still a believer of high velocity and will be until proven wrong." End of quote. Yes, you heard that right. He killed a buffalo with his .375 Weatherby and then shot the already deceased buffalo with his .257 Weatherby. The performance he describes on that animal, and let's assume he's telling the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth here, is indeed impressive. But shooting an already dead buffalo with the .257 Weatherby is a far cry from killing one with a single shot, as is alleged sometimes. I read Roy's entire diary about the hunt 3 times, and I did not find any mention of him killing a Cape buffalo with the .257 Weatherby, and that incident with the dead buffalo is the only mention of him shooting a buffalo with the cartridge at all, though like I said, he shot multiple buffalo with the bigger .375 Weatherby on that hunt. That said, all I've established to this point is that Roy Weatherby did not kill a Cape buffalo with a .257 Weatherby on his 1948 trip to Africa. He went on multiple trips to the continent, and it certainly could be possible he did that on a subsequent trip. I'm going to move on to another source for this alleged incident, but just remember where he shot the buffalo in the passage I just read. The ham. Now, it just so happens that Weatherby marketing director Zachary Hine interviewed Adam Weatherby in episode 34 of the Weatherby on Our Mark podcast, and they talk specifically about the 257 Weatherby in that episode. Not only do they talk about that cartridge, but they discuss the fact that Adam's grandfather, Roy Weatherby, supposedly killed a buffalo with it, and cited a passage in an issue of Guns and Ammo that said as much. Amazingly to me, Adam said he had never heard this story prior to their discussion during this podcast. We'll talk more about that in a minute. For reference, this Weatherby podcast aired on 9 February 2022. I've put a link to this episode in the show notes. But I tracked down that magazine issue they referenced in that interview. It was the September 1962 issue of Guns and Ammo, and I purchased a copy of that issue off eBay. There is an article in that issue titled The High Priest of High Velocity by John Lachuk. I apologize if I mispronounced his last name. It is spelled Lachuk. I'll read you the relevant passages from this issue on page 46 and page 47. I quote, Weatherby concedes that shock does not play as great a part in killing members of Africa's big three, rhino, buffalo, and elephant, as it does with the lesser animals. Because of their huge bulk, these creatures can absorb tremendous punishment and remain on their feet, he says. Even so, Weatherby downed a 1-ton African Cape buffalo with a hit in the animal's ham by a 100-grain 257 Weatherby Magnum. When the animal was dissected, its hip was found to be broken and its internal organs looked as if it had swallowed a hand grenade. Although the 257 convincingly stopped the buffalo, Weatherby certainly does not recommend it as a buffalo rifle. He wouldn't have chosen to use it himself, but it was the only gun at hand when the aggressive bull suddenly came charging out of the brush, headed for one of the other hunters. End of quote. Well, there you have it, right? This is proof this incident clearly happened. Reading that story whetted my appetite for more information about this incident. For instance, I was curious about what specific bullet he used. Was it a Hornady Spire Point? Something else? What country was he hunting in? What year did this happen? So I called up Weatherby myself, told them what I had learned from that magazine and from the Weatherby book, and I asked if they had more information. That was a very interesting conversation I had with the Weatherby customer service representative. He said that the folks at Weatherby have no record of Roy Weatherby ever killing a Cape buffalo with the 257 Weatherby cartridge. He didn't come right out and say this incident did not happen, but he seemed to indicate the Guns and Ammo article may have contained some incorrect information on that count. And so we're clear, nobody is accusing anybody of lying right here. He's not saying that, I'm not saying that. There are a couple of possibilities that could explain what is going on here. I'll talk briefly about it now and then again more here later in this episode. First, perhaps the author of the Guns and Ammo article misunderstood Roy when Roy talked about shooting that buffalo with his 257 Weatherby. Maybe he heard that Roy wanted to shoot a buffalo with it, which he did, and maybe he also heard that Roy shot a dead buffalo with it and was impressed with the performance that he observed, which Weatherby did claim to do, and he said he was impressed by the performance of the round on that buffalo in his diary. And with those things in mind, maybe the author just honestly got confused and wrote up that passage incorrectly. That is certainly possible. I can think of many instances in my life, and maybe you can as well, where there is a legitimate misunderstanding about what happened, and then the more interesting story is the one that gets repeated and passed around. Now, remember what I told you earlier about the location Roy shot the buff in the story from the book, in the ham. Well, you may have noticed that's where Roy Weatherby allegedly shot this buffalo in the Guns and Ammo article. Now, he did say he used an 87-grain bullet in the book and a 100-grain bullet in the magazine, though. It's possible we're talking about two separate incidents, but it's also possible that discrepancy is due to more confusion and or misremembering. Okay, now let's go back to the fact that Adam Weatherby said in that interview on the Weatherby podcast that he had never heard this story before of his grandfather killing a Cape buffalo with the 257 Weatherby. And I want to be clear that I believe Adam when he says that. Now, I would have thought this incident would be a part of the lore around Weatherby that everyone who worked there could quote chapter and verse, sort of like that moose John Nosler had those issues with on his famous hunt back in the 1940s that has since become part of the Nosler lore. Now, not only is the 257 Weatherby buffalo story a heck of a tale, which is why we are talking about it so many years later, but killing a buffalo with a 257 Weatherby, especially shooting it in the ham, as is described, is a heck of a marketing achievement. And if there's one thing everybody, even his detractors, can agree on, it's that Roy Weatherby was a heck of a marketer. If I owned a gun company and I instantly killed an animal, like a Cape buffalo, with a rifle in a cartridge that I not only designed, but was substantially smaller than what people typically use on Cape buffalo, you can darn sure bet everyone would know about it. I would have mounted that buffalo and hung that taxidermy mount in a prominent spot in my store or my office, and viewing that mount and hearing the story would be mandatory for every new employee and every important visitor to my place of business. Now, I'm joking here, but you get the point. The 257 Weatherby was Roy's favorite cartridge, too. Killing the buffalo, as described like that, should have been his crowning achievement and proof that his theory on the killing power of really high-velocity projectiles worked. Heck, I cannot think of a better advertisement of that fact than instantly killing a Cape buffalo with a shot to the rear ham with that tiny little bullet. Roy talks at length in his book about searching for the perfect cartridge-bullet combination that would deliver instant kills on game no matter where you hit them. Well, with that in mind, you would think this incident would have gotten a lot more play because the incident described in this magazine article would seem to be a major feather in his cap and validation that his way of doing things was indeed the best. So the fact that Adam Weatherby, the current president of Weatherby and Roy Weatherby's grandson, had never heard that story before, and the fact that the folks at Weatherby, when I called them and asked them point blank, had no details on the incident they could share with me, and the fact that Roy seems to have shot an already dead buffalo with the cartridge as a quote-unquote test of the round, are all strong indications to me that Roy Weatherby did not, in fact, kill a live Cape buffalo with a 257 Weatherby, no matter what the internet says. The folks at Weatherby were also very clear that the book I keep referencing by the Greshams is the quote-unquote official Weatherby biography, both for Roy Weatherby, the man, and the Weatherby Company. If there is a conflict between the book and another source, their stance is the book is correct. I also had a phone call with a different person from the Weatherby universe. I'm not sure he wants me to mention his name, so I won't. But I'll just say that he's in the Weatherby universe but does not work directly for Weatherby. He said that he had read the Weatherby book and he had read the Guns and Ammo article many years ago. But he confessed to me that in his mind he must have conflated and combined those two stories and honestly believed the Guns and Ammo story was the same one as in the book that was taken from Roy's diaries. It seemed like an honest mistake from a guy who read those publications many decades in the past and simply misremembered them. And to be fair, this article in the Guns and Ammo magazine I keep referencing was published over 60 years ago as I record this. Now, funny enough, we're not done with this subject, and there's still some more interesting things I want to share with you. Now, while I was doing research for my .25 caliber episode 328, I consulted my old Speer number 10 reloading manual published in 1981 for info about the 250 Savage, 257 Roberts, 25-06, and the 257 Weatherby. Here's what it said on page 171 in the 257 Weatherby section. The cartridge has been widely used not only in North America, but also in Africa, and it has killed some very large, tough animals. Wallace Taber, lecturer and writer, is very fond of the cartridge and used it in Africa to kill a Cape buffalo, a practice not generally recommended. However, the .257 Weatherby Magnum has also been used on the very tough zebra and most of the small and medium-sized African antelope. Well, that's interesting. Who the heck is Wallace Taber, you say? Wallace Taber, a.k.a. Wally Taber, was a writer and sportsman who also made several trips to Africa in those post-World War II years. He is not nearly as famous today as guys like Roy Weatherby or Jack O'Connor, but Wally also had quite an influence on things back then, and stories he wrote about his trips over to Africa helped whet an appetite for hunting on the continent among American hunters. Well, Wallace Taber published a book titled The Rifle in Africa in January of 1953. This book was basically just a collection of articles written by Taber and some other people concerning hunting in Africa. And he actually also talked about fishing in Africa too. Wally was a big angler as well. In addition to that, the book also contained articles talking about the different species available to hunt over there, and it contained sketches of what those animals look like, talked about taxidermy, things like that. Now, there is a picture on the cover of that book of Wally holding a Weatherby rifle with a dead buffalo at his feet. More on this in a second. Well, Roy Weatherby wrote an article titled Mighty Midgets or Shoulder Cannons, and Wally Taber included that article in his book The Rifle in Africa, published January of 1953. Roy Weatherby says the following on page 47 of that book. Ordinarily, we use the .375 Weatherby Magnum or the .300 Weatherby Magnum on buffalo. Some we even shot with the .257 Weatherby Magnum, shooting the 100-grain soft-nose bullet. This is a story hard for the average hunter to believe. On one occasion, a 2,000-pound Cape buffalo shot in the hip with the 100-grain bullet at 3,700 feet per second from the .257 dropped and died instantly. The bullet hole in the outer skin could hardly be detected. However, when we cut the ham from the carcass, one could almost put his fist through the bone where this tiny projectile had made its way. The intestines of this animal were a complete mass of destruction. The shock was too great for even that ton-sized beast. End of quote. Now remember from earlier that Roy Weatherby went on his first African safari in June and July of 1948. Though I found reference to the aforementioned incident where he shot the already deceased buffalo with an 87-grain bullet from his .257 Weatherby, I could find no reference to him actually killing a buffalo on that safari with the .257 Weatherby, though he did indeed kill a buffalo with his .375 Weatherby on that trip. As far as I know, Roy went back to Africa for his next hunt in 1953. This is what the Weatherby book says, both for the timing of the first hunt and the fact that he returned in 1953. But the book does not mention a specific time frame for the second hunt like it does the first hunt. It just says 1953. Well, Robert Scott mentions starting a safari with Roy Weatherby in Africa during February of 1953 in his book Between the Elephant's Eyes. If that is indeed the case, then Roy wrote this article for Wally Taber's book I just referenced prior to that second safari. Now, interestingly, you may have noticed that Roy does not specifically say that he killed the buffalo in that story contained in Taber's book himself. He just says that it happened. Rather, he says that, quote unquote, we shot some buffalo using the cartridge. To quote him again, some we even shot with the .257 Weatherby Magnum, end of quote. Now remember, he went on that first hunt in Africa, I think with 7 other American hunters. Now, is he saying that as a group, 1 to 2 of those other hunters killed a buffalo with the .257? Or did they all kill a buffalo with the .257? It's not clear. But he never comes out and says, I did this, or that so-and-so did this. He's ambiguous with the details regarding who, what, where, and exactly how they did so. Now, you may have noticed that this story seems very similar to the one described in the Guns and Ammo article. It also seems very similar to the one he details in his diary about shooting the already dead Cape buffalo in 1948 that I keep referencing. Though, like I said earlier, Weatherby said he used that 87-grain bullet on the 1948 hunt in the book, but the other two stories involve a 100-grain bullet. Now, to recap, we have 3 stories talking about shooting a Cape buffalo in the rear ham with a .257 Weatherby. So Roy himself says in his diary he shot that already dead buffalo in the rear ham. Then we have Roy himself saying in an article published in 1953, nearly 5 years after his first trip to Africa, but as far as I can tell, published prior to his second trip to Africa, that, quote-unquote, we did so. But he does not claim to do so himself specifically. Then we have another article published in 1962 and written by another person stating Roy himself killed a Cape buffalo with the .257 Weatherby with a shot to the rear ham. And not only did Roy kill the buffalo with the little cartridge himself, but the Guns and Ammo article says that Roy did so during a charge, no less. I also find it interesting that the story got progressively more entertaining and dramatic as time went by. Now, the fact that all 3 of these stories involve shooting a Cape buffalo in the rear ham also make me skeptical that it really happened. It's just a little too dramatic and a little too over the top, especially the charge in the Guns and Ammo article. Now, to be clear, it is certainly possible to kill a Cape buffalo with a shot like that. For example, the bullet could hit the femoral artery. An injury like that would not result in instant death, but I could absolutely believe a person shot a buffalo in the rear ham, then it ran off into the brush, and then the hunters found it dead when they followed it 30 minutes later. Likewise, if the story were that Weatherby shot a more or less broadside Cape buffalo with the .257, it hit the lungs, and they followed it up and eventually found it dead. Yeah, I could believe that. I wouldn't recommend doing it. I wouldn't do it myself, but that's a less fantastical story for me to believe. That said, just because this is an unlikely turn of events described in these stories doesn't mean it didn't happen. For instance, it is possible to observe an instant kill on an animal after a very high velocity impact from a bullet that hits in a quote-unquote non-vital spot. I'm going to read to you a quote from the book Rifle in America by Phil Sharp. This is page 702 and 703 of the book. This author recalls experimental research conducted with one of the early experimental 220 Swifts in a velocity in excess of 4,000 feet per second. A report came to him from one of the experimental engineers and was duly witnessed. It seems that a mule condemned for service was about to be executed, and experimenters desired to use this mule as a test object. The experiment was conducted with 2 prominent physicians in attendance to observe the effects of the very tiny high-velocity bullet. This mule was tied to a stake at a range of about 75 yards to await his demise. The rifleman stood by with a .30-06 Springfield with heavy expanding hunting ammunition, ready to put the mule out of misery. A single shot with the tiny 46-grain soft-point bullet was fired into the mule, and the section selected for this shot was the paunch. Hunters of experience insist that this is the poorest possible shot on game, and, since it eventually dies, it invariably escapes from the hunter and can travel many miles before exhaustion takes its toll. When the experimental shot was fired, the mule fell over as though struck in the forehead with a sledgehammer. There was no reflex action to the muscles. He died instantly and without a quiver. The doctors immediately went to work. One of those noted surgeons examined the wound and failed to find it serious enough to cause death from all general appearances. Yet the mule was dead. An autopsy was performed, and one astounded surgeon remarked, "This is the most amazing experiment I have ever witnessed. This mule has all the symptoms of death by electrocution rather than death by gunshot wound." End of quote. Now, Phil Sharp does not have a reputation for exaggeration or for slick marketing. I see him as a more measured and skeptical sort of fellow. And though he says he did not witness this happen with his own eyes, it seems to be that the person that told him this story was what he considered a reliable source. And the fact that Phil put it in this book makes me believe that Phil believed it did actually happen. Now, yes, it is true that a mule is not a Cape buffalo, and it was also not shot in the same spot, and it was also not shot with the same cartridge. Right? A .257 Weatherby is not a .220 Swift. But a .257 Weatherby shoots a bullet approximately twice as heavy, almost as fast as what we're talking about with the .220 Swift. And they shot that mule in this experiment at 75 yards, and it sounds like in the stories, at least in the guns and ammo story, that this was a very close range impact on the allegedly charging buffalo that he shot. So it's possible, I'm just guessing here, or making an educated guess here, it is possible that we're dealing with a situation where if these two incidents happened as described, you're having a similar impact velocity with that a little bit slower .257 Weatherby round striking at a velocity almost as fast as the .220 Swift would be at a little bit longer range, out at 75 yards. So yes, it is possible that you could have a situation where a person shoots a Cape buffalo in the hip with a .257 Weatherby and kills it instantly. I would not say that it is likely, but I will grant that it is possible. Things like this do happen from time to time, and they do require a very high velocity impact to deliver results like that. But those results can be inconsistent, and sometimes you will observe an instant kill as described, but other times the animal will behave as though nothing happened despite what looks like an identical shot. What about Wallace Taber? I mentioned earlier the Spear Reloading Manual says that he killed a buffalo with the .257 Weatherby as well. To learn more about this incident, let's check out the November 1956 issue of Guns magazine. And as a quick aside, this particular magazine issue also had articles by Elmer Keith and Charles Askins. It also contains an article titled Hunting Elephant with a Deer Rifle by Wallace Taber. Now, this article also contains the aforementioned photo from the cover of Taber's book, Rifleman in Africa. And there's a caption of that photo in the magazine that states that Taber killed that buffalo in the photo with a Weatherby scoped .300 Magnum. Anyway, Taber had the following to say on page 51 of this magazine. I quote, "Had I been able to procure the necessary solids, I would and could have dropped elephant with my favorite Weatherby .257, and possibly even my .228 Ackley Magnum. I did manage to drop a mangy old Cape buffalo with a Weatherby .257 Magnum using Norma's 100 grain soft points. That might have been stretching both rifle and ammo slightly, but necessity mothered that invention. So stone dead did that belligerent buff drop that I am satisfied the combination would come close to spelling curtains for bull elephant." Now I'm going to jump ahead a little bit in this same article to page 52. I quote, "I've not kept account of the number of pieces of big game I've shot, but accept my word for it, it has been considerable. And, with the exception of a single ponderous Cape buffalo, I have never killed a single head with anything larger than .30 caliber, nor with a bullet heavier than 180 grains. That single exception was brought on by a white hunter who was getting paid to see that I returned with my skin intact and completely unsold on small caliber high velocity, the same as is Keith." He's referring to Elmer Keith here as a quick aside. Stepping back into the article, I quote, "He insisted I use his 450 number 2 spouting 500 grains of soft point with which to dispatch the Cape Buffalo. We compromised. I used a 375 H&H Magnum with 300 grain slug. Later, when the white hunter was off in another part of the country and couldn't be held responsible for my skin, I satisfied my ego by dropping an equally ponderous Cape Buff with my 257 Weatherby Magnum, handling a 100-grain bullet. The mighty bovine dropped in its tracks with a single shot in the neck. Of course, there were 60 grains of 4350 pushing the lightweight missile at a speed 3,710 feet per second, something which I dare say Keith has never experienced with calibers of 33 and over, or his missiles of 300 grains and upwards." End of quote. Okay, so though he may have been talking about two separate buffalo in those passages, it seems pretty clear that he has shot at least one buffalo in the neck with a 100-grain soft-point bullet, and probably a Norma soft-point bullet. I'll bet that's probably the same buffalo he referenced in each one of those passages within the same article. Not too many other details in here about exactly where he was hunting or exactly when or any of that, but like I said, he says he shot it in the neck, 100-grain soft-point from a 257 Weatherby. Taber also wrote another book titled Assignment Safari, a Newspaper Reporter in Africa. First edition published October 1951. Like the book Rifleman in Africa, this book is a collection of articles. Well, this book contains an article written by Taber titled Ballistically, They Frighten Me. And that article contains a passage that is word for word identical to the second passage I just read about him shooting that buffalo in the neck with the 257 when his pH was elsewhere and couldn't stop him from doing so. That passage appears on page 23 of Assignment Safari, and so it seems clear that this incident he described of shooting the buffalo in the neck, if it did indeed happen the way he described it, occurred prior to the early 1950s. First edition of this book published October 1951. I have the third edition. That was published January 1953. So I don't know if this story was in the original first edition, but it certainly, if it did not occur prior to October 1951, it did occur prior to 1953. And then seems like he rolled that same story into an article he sold to Guns Magazine a few years later in 1956. Now, Taber himself wrote both of these articles, so they are primary sources. I would like more details, but the fact that he himself says what he did makes them more credible. Once again, it's not guaranteed to be true, right? He could be lying, he could be stretching the truth, but it is more credible than somebody else saying Taber did this on its own. I'll also say it is easier for me to believe that Wally Taber killed a buffalo with a shot to the neck with the 257 Weatherby than with a shot to the rear ham, like we keep hearing about Roy. Like I said, I am not accusing anyone of outright lying or anything like that. But my research makes me strongly inclined to believe that Roy Weatherby did not kill a Cape buffalo with the 257 Weatherby. And yes, I know, it's hard to believe, but something we read on the internet, and really even something that we read in books, was not true. And I believed and passed on that story myself for many years too, so I'm not casting aspersions here. I will say that even though I doubt Roy Weatherby killed a Cape buffalo with the 257 Weatherby himself, I'm pretty certain somebody has indeed killed a Cape buffalo with this cartridge, and perhaps multiple people have done so. It seems very likely Wally Taber did so, though there could very well be others, to include possibly Roy Weatherby, though personally I think that is not likely. And of course, this could include some of Roy's friends or hunting companions, and I'll talk more about this here in a second. So what is going on here? Where did this rumor come from? First, it's possible this story is true, and the people at Weatherby, the Greshams who wrote the Weatherby biography, and I just can't find any supporting information to back it up. I wouldn't say that's likely, but I'll grant that it's possible. Second, it's possible the story is true, but maybe Roy had second thoughts about using the story for marketing. Maybe he thought promoting the story of shooting the buffalo and killing it with the 257 Weatherby and possibly encouraging someone else to do so by example was irresponsible. Though as far as I know, Weatherby himself and everyone at the company have always said they do not recommend using the 257 Weatherby for buffalo. Now, they were still British colonies at the time, but the countries we now know as Kenya and Tanzania in East Africa both banned the use of cartridges smaller than .375 caliber for dangerous game in the 1950s too. So not only would using the 257 Weatherby on buffalo be a poor choice for practical reasons, it would also be illegal to do so after the rules changed. Plus, Weatherby sells other cartridges besides the 257 Weatherby. In fact, they make several larger bore cartridges that they promote for use on thick-skinned, dangerous game. That lineup began with the 375 Weatherby before eventually expanding to the 378, 460, and finally the 416 Weatherby. And the folks at Weatherby could sell rifles in those cartridges to Weatherby fans in pursuit of thick-skinned, dangerous game. And though the details of what country you're hunting in and when and whatnot, because the minimum caliber did change a couple of times in different countries over the years, but at various times and in various places, all of those cartridges have been legal to use on thick-skinned, dangerous game and are more practical choices for doing so than the little 257 Weatherby. So yes, maybe it's possible this indeed did happen, but the folks at Weatherby are intentionally keeping mum about it for those reasons. While I think that scenario, or the first one, that it also did happen, but just nobody has any proof about it, I would say they're possible. I don't think either one is especially likely. No, I personally believe the story about Roy Weatherby shooting the already deceased Cape Buffalo with the 257 Weatherby took on a life of its own over the years. Roy Weatherby was a brilliant marketer and had a larger-than-life personality in the hunting world. Shooting a buffalo with the 257 Weatherby as a test or a marketing stunt is something most people could very reasonably picture him doing. And indeed, he said he wanted to do exactly that. It is possible that other people honestly did kill a Cape Buffalo with the 257 Weatherby, and the fact that they did so and their story somehow got attached to Roy due to his affinity for the cartridge and the fact that he pushed the envelope on things like that sometimes. Here's an example on a completely separate subject that might illustrate this point a little bit better. Back when I was a cadet at West Point, this would be my senior year, the Commandant of Cadets, he was a brigadier general, was very popular. The cadets just loved him. He was also a big deer hunter. Well, the fall of my senior year, he shot a deer out in one of the training areas where you could hunt, and the deer ran like 50 or 100 yards and died like right on the edge of one of the lakes at West Point. And so it died in the water. And he went over and dragged the deer out of the water, and somebody saw him doing that and came over and gave him a hand and all of that stuff. So that's what happened. He shot the deer. It ran a short distance, died in the water. He pulled it out. Well, within about 48 hours, a story had started circulating among the cadets that the commandant had shot this deer, wounded it. It ran into the lake. He went in after it. The deer charged him. He grabbed the deer by its antlers and then drowned it in the lake. So what was a pretty benign original story turned into this just fantastical tale that ended up bearing very little resemblance to what actually happened. And the commandant did not do anything to perpetuate this story either. It just took on a life of its own. It is very easy for me to believe that story of Weatherby and the buffalo gradually turned into a tall tale in a similar matter to the story of the deer in the lake I just described. So that's what I think happened. I think he shot that already dead buffalo with the 257 Weatherby, and that was the end of the story. And then it just, like I said, it just took off and it's become its own thing over the past 60 years. And like I said, too, the folks at Weatherby agree with me on this point, and they say they have no record of him ever shooting and killing a live buffalo with the 257 Weatherby cartridge. I am willing to believe I could be wrong on this count, though. And if you have solid information about this alleged incident, or some additional sources that I should consult, I went through a pretty extensive list of books and read a bunch of stuff trying to research this. But if you have some other sources that I don't know about, some more information on this subject, then I would love to hear it. And if we somehow dig up proof that Roy Weatherby did indeed kill a Cape Buffalo with the .257 Weatherby cartridge, I will happily correct the record here and describe the facts of the true incident in detail, so everyone can know the actual facts about that incident. Now, I'm not trying to take any shine off the .257 Weatherby Magnum. I think it is a wonderful choice for hunting all sorts of stuff. I would happily take it on a plains game hunt in Africa. I would happily take it deer, antelope, or even elk hunting. I darn sure wouldn't take it Cape Buffalo hunting, and I don't think Roy Weatherby actually killed a Cape Buffalo with it either. It's also important to understand here, I am not trying to tear down Roy Weatherby. He was a brilliant innovator and an incredible marketer. His story is a great example of the American dream come true, where he started off with a dream and a vision, and now here we are many years later with Weatherby being one of the pillars of the American hunting and shooting community. And it is still a family-owned and operated company, too. All of those things are still true, regardless of whether Roy Weatherby killed a buffalo with the .257 Weatherby Magnum or not. So there we go, folks. There you have it. I've talked for nearly an hour about this subject. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you enjoyed hearing some of those other stories kind of intertwined with this one about Wallace Taber and about the incident with the mule getting shot with a .220 Swift and all of those things. And by the way, share this episode and this podcast with any friends or family members you think might find it interesting. And you can also post it on a hunting or shooting forum and help get the word out about the Big Game Hunting Podcast and this episode in particular out that way. Now, if you enjoyed this podcast and you would like access to some bonus content, join me on Patreon at patreon.com/BigGameHunter. There's also a link in the show notes. I do live listener Q&A sessions there periodically. I publish the results of some ballistic gel tests and comparisons on Patreon as well that I don't put anywhere else on YouTube or any of those other places. And I also prioritize correspondence with my supporters on Patreon above anybody else, just because I get so many questions. But if you email me, tell me you're a Patreon supporter, or you message me through the Patreon system, you go to the front of the line and I can give you a more timely response to all of that stuff. So like I said, click the link in the show notes or go to patreon.com/BigGameHunter. Remember, you can make your dream hunt turn into a reality, and we can help. Thanks for listening. I'll see you back here next time on the Big Game Hunting Podcast.
This show may be over, but we have plenty more for you on our website. For more information on today's topic, as well as lots of other useful hunting resources, head over to the BigGameHuntingBlog.com. We look forward to having you back for the next episode. But until then, happy hunting.
Hey, I'm Ryan Reynolds. At Mint Mobile, we like to do the opposite of what Big Wireless does. They charge you a lot, we charge you a little. So naturally, when they announced they'd be raising their prices due to inflation, we decided to deflate our prices due to not hating you. That's right. We're cutting the price of Mint Unlimited from $30 a month to just $15 a month. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 upfront payment equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes. See details.